Welcome to our webinar, which is this MISQ showcase event on the special issue on building digital resilience against major shocks. So we have a good lineup today, 5 presentations in addition to an opening and a closing. So perhaps I will invite Andrew to get started to basically share with us some opening remarks.
Well, hello, everybody. It's just so wonderful to be with you, and a huge congratulations to the team, Waifong, Panos, Balaji, Shiva, and a big thanks to Arun, who will give some comments at the end of this, because he saw the vision of this right at the beginning, and it's just wonderful to get to this point. My congratulations to all the authors who'll be presenting their work, and I think we're in for a great session. Before this session, I was reading one of the UN reports that was entitled Our World at Risk, which I think sums up the sort of existential threats that we're facing and that motivated much of this special issue. And those threats raise serious questions around governance and technology, data, institutional change, and human behavior, all topics that are fundamental to our field. But how should we study them? That was really the drive of this special issue. And we need new concepts. We need new ways of conducting research in these contexts. We need new empirical evidence. And we really need a community of researchers who can begin this work and lead that work in the future. So that's what this special issue has set out to create. And I think it's been enormously successful. I'm looking forward to hearing all the talks, and I'll hand it to Shiva to get us started. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Shiva Vishwanathan. I'm a faculty at the University of Maryland College Park. So it's really great to see, I think we had 250 people registered. So currently we have about 130 people on this call. So welcome everyone, and a very good day wherever you are. So I wanted to kind of share a few thoughts about this and also thank a few people. But let me start with a short story. All right. So there was, some of you might have heard this. So there was once a Zen master who was living high up in the Himalayas. And one day, 2 novice monks decide to join his monastery. And after a very long, intense session of meditation, they were both outside during the break. And it was very cold outside, so they start smoking. So the first monk looks at the second monk and asks him, do you think it's okay for monks who meditate to smoke? And the second monk says, I don't know, let's ask our master. So the next day, they're back again after their session during the break. And this time the first monk is still smoking and the second monk has stopped smoking. So the first monk is surprised and he asks the second monk, what did the master tell you? And the second monk says, I asked the master if it's okay for monks who meditate to smoke. And the master said, no. And the second monk is even more surprised. And he asks the first monk, what did the master tell you? And the first monk says, the master told me, yes, it's okay for monks to smoke. So the second monk asks him, what did you ask the master? And the first monk says, I asked the master if it's okay for monks who smoke to meditate, and he said yes. So that's basically tells you that asking the right question is everything, right? So not just in life, but also for us researchers, the most important thing is to ask the right question. And a very wise man I know, said, refer to this as the type 3 error, right? And today in the era of chat GPT and prompt engineering, asking the right question is everything, right? It's becoming a whole engineering discipline in itself. So I wanted to thank our authors, a lot of people who actually submitted wonderful papers to the special issue. We had almost 58 or so submissions. A lot of them were very good submissions, but we were very constrained in terms of time. I want to really thank the authors of these 4 papers in the special issue for asking the right questions, because asking the right questions is getting half your work done. And these papers also had enough work done before the submission that they could converge very, very quickly. Right? I also wanted to thank our wonderful team of referees and associate editors, without whom none of this would have been possible. They were very diligent, provided very, very useful, constructive feedback, and that too within a very, very short period of time. Right. Most importantly, I wanted to thank our vice then master, Professor Arun Rai, and Arun was instrumental in getting this whole thing started. I remember this was at the peak of COVID in the very first phase 1, I think. And Arun was dealing with all of these back-to-back meetings with the president, the provost, the state legislatures, you name it. And he sends me a text saying, Shiva, can we chat tonight? And I was like, oops, what did I do this time? So maybe he wants to kick me out of the editorial board. And I wasn't sure if I should be happy or sad about that, but that's a different issue. And then he calls me at night and says, oh, I have more work for you. Why don't we just talk about this special issue? And we had some very, very interesting conversations. We discussed a lot of possibilities. And thanks to his vision, his leadership, his foresight, we converged on this topic of digital resilience. And I'm sure it's going to turn out to be a very, very, very important issue if it isn't already. Right? So one of the things that came out of these conversations, I mean, we kind of talked about a lot of different possibilities, but I was a bit skeptical about this initially because I wasn't sure if we had enough time, if researchers had enough time to collect data, work on this, especially that it was like the early stages of COVID, but very, very surprised to see how innovative, how resourceful our IS researchers are. And we had a wonderful set of submissions. I'm hoping that we will see a lot of these papers, if like, that were not in the special issue. I'm sure we will see them in regular issues and other top journals as well, right? So once we kind of converged on this topic, Arun said, now we really need some really good co-editors. He didn't say we need other good co-editors. He said, oh, we need really good co-editors. I mean, I didn't try to push him for more details on that, but I got the message. So I wanted to thank, I don't think we could have assembled a more complementary, a more competent set of co-editors. So a huge thanks to Balaji, Panos, Waifong for all the hard work. And I think none of us could have done what the other brings to the table. So in that sense, it worked extremely well. And before I forget, I want to thank our wonderful EIC, Andrew. I'm really sorry to see him step down. He's done a lot for the journal. He's been amazing for the journal in such a short time. But more importantly, for this special issue, I don't think without his guidance, we couldn't have done this in such a short time. Right? I want to thank him and also Emily and other people in MISQ who made this possible. Right? So I don't want to take more time. I want to invite our presenters. So we have 4 papers. The only thing I wanted to say about these papers is each of them deals with a different level of analysis. Right? The first paper talks about individual digital resilience. The second paper focuses on organizational digital resilience. The third paper focuses on community digital resilience. And the fourth paper focuses on state or governmental level digital resilience. And I don't think we could have planned this. Definitely this wasn't planned, but this goes to show how deep and widespread this shock was and how it affected everybody across the board. And we hope that this special issue was the first spark to a lot more interesting and creative work in this space. And we'll have a lot more discussions as we go along, but let me stop here and invite our first presenter. So I think we'll have about 8 or 9 minutes for each presentation, followed by 5 or 6 minutes of discussion, right? And hopefully we'll take it as it goes, and we probably can have some audience participation as well.
So for the audience, as you have questions, please just key them into the Q&A panel, right? The discussants will actually raise them to the presenters. So we can have our first presenter, Hong Lin.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my share screen? Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in this event on the MISQ quarterly special issue on digital resilience. We also thank the editors and effort to organizing this excellent event. So we are very lucky to become one of the 4 accepted paper in this special issue, and we are Liu Tao, Liu Xin, Xu Yongjing from Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and I'm Hong Deng from Hongji University. So for the digital resilience, what we know, first of all, what we know is the importance of resilience, especially in the healthcare. It's when we focus on the pandemic in the past few years. And what we know, another thing is from the literature, we know the 3 dimensions of the concept of resilience. The first one is prevention, to try to prevent the negative events from occurrence. And the second and third one is the resistance and recovery. Then that focus on the post-negative event. The event has happened, but whether we can try to resist and recover from the negative events. So that's the 3 dimensions of this concept of resilience. And from the literature, we know that the existing healthcare studies mainly focus on the first dimension, prevention, to prevent some predictable disruptions to happening. But what we don't know here is, especially in the healthcare domain, there are many unpredictable and unprecedented disruptions happening. So, for example, the sudden outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic is the recent example, and everyone may experience this. Then, whether and how the using IT artifacts can build digital resilience is what we don't know, and our paper is trying to answer this question. So what we are focusing here, as I explained earlier, we focus on the specific context of the first wave of sudden outbreak of COVID-19 outbreak, and especially on the healthcare domain. Then, as Siva just introduced, we are focusing on the individual level. So it is the physicians try to apply an IT artifact and information system to achieve digital resilience. Then the IT artifact we focus on in this paper is the online healthcare communities, and the physicians can provide information and telemedicine service on the platform. Then patients can consult the physician on the platform. Then the resilience, what we're trying to conduct here, the resilience, how to measure resilience, right? We know resilience, but how to measure resilience? In here, we use physicians' performance before and after the outbreak as an indicator. Here, for the performance, we focus on the consultation per week for a physician. Then, of course, if a physician's performance is good, then their consultations per week will be more, right? Yeah. Then our research question, as I explained before, whether and how using IT artifacts can build digital resilience in this context. And intuitively, of course, we applied information system can achieve digital resilience. Then we have 2 groups of physicians. One is applied IT artifacts, we call it OHG physicians, and another group is they don't apply IT artifacts, non-OHG physicians. Then we know that they can build resilience, but which dimensions they can build, we don't know. Then we are trying to answer the question here is they have resistance and recovery after the sudden outbreak. And we go a step further to open the black box of the source of resilience. Why physicians apply IT artifacts can achieve resistance? Because they can acquire more new patients. The logic is very straightforward and simple. I try to explain here. After the sudden outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, immediately people cannot go to the hospital, offline hospital. So they only can transfer to online platforms, and thus OHC physicians can attract more patients. Then their performance or the consultation per week will remain higher than non-OHC physicians, which means they can resist some loss from the outbreak. This is the resistance effects we observe in the immediate after the outbreak. Then in the long term, we try to recovery from the offline outpatient visits. Then as OHC physician has already absorbed many online physicians, online patients, then they can transfer these new patients to offline outpatients in the long-term period. So in the recovery period, they also receive faster recovery on the performance compared with non-OHCC physicians. So this is what we call the recovery effect after the outbreak in the long term, in the subsequent period. So this is our main logic of the story. Our method, we try to use the observational data from hospital, online and offline, combine online and offline data to test our hypothesis. The offline set we use from a main hospital in mainland China, and we can observe all the offline outpatient consultation records and medical records for each patient at each consultation. And the online, we extract the data from a main OHC in mainland China, and we match the physicians in the offline and online in a physical level to calculate their overall consultations. Some of them may have online and offline for OHC physicians, but for non-OHC physicians, they only have the offline consultation number. Then we use an EID analysis. First, we use PSM to match OHC physician and non-OHC physician to ensure the parallel trends. And second one, we use the DID specifications by applying the total consultation and offline consultation to as the DVs in our equation. So here is the main effect we observe. First of all, we can see that before the outbreak, that OHC physician and non-OHC physician, we use the solid line or dot line to demonstrate that. Both OHC and non-OHC are not so different, right? They are parallel before the pandemic. But once the pandemic outbreak, we can see that both of them has a significant decrease on the consultation numbers, which means their performance is largely negatively influenced for the both online healthcare communication, OHC physician and non-OHC physician. But what we see here is non-OHC physician reduced at a very, very low level, about less than 10 consultations per week. And for OHC physician, they receive a higher level of the performance, which means there is a gap or a difference here. This difference is what we call the resistance. They suffer less loss for OHC physicians in their consultation part. This is the resistance effect. And then similar patterns in the recovery effect, we can see a very huge gap here, which means for online healthcare participants, they absorb more patients or transfer more patients in the offline from online after the outbreak in the subsequent period. So their recovery speed is much faster than non-OHC physicians. This is what we observe the main effect of resistance and recovery for OHC versus non-OHC physicians. Then another main findings is what we call the source of the resilience. As we explained, OHC physician can achieve higher level of resilience because they can observe more new patients. Yes, we can see that for OHCC physicians, after the outbreak, their online new patients become more, which means many new patients comes from online channel. They may go to the offline channel, but after the outbreak, sudden outbreak, they have to try to find OHC physicians to make consultation. This is the source of resistance. And then after that, in the recovery period, this part of the patient.
Sorry, Honglin. Actually, time is about up. Do you think you can wrap it up quickly so we can move on to the discussion?
The last slide. This is the last slide. Yeah. So this online patient transfer to offline, then we recovery faster. So this is the main effect or main story we cover. And we also have a series of heterogeneity analysis. For more details, the readers can refer to our paper. So this is our main story of the paper. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes. Okay. So thank you very much, Honglin. And no, it was a short presentation, but hopefully everybody has a chance to read these papers in the special issue. I just want to kind of touch upon this problem with the serial correlation in your data. I'm just kidding. I just want to kind of so one of the things that was really interesting for us in this paper is that you identified these two phases. One is the resistance phase to the shock, and the second is the recovery phase. And that kind of has a lot of parallels with the framework that we have in our editorial as well. I'm sure my co-editors will talk more about our framework, but I was just wondering if you thought about this in terms of, is there a relationship between the two? Like, I'm wondering if you have better resistance, is that associated with recovery, or are these independent in the sense that you have more problems with resistance, but you still are able to recover? So I'm wondering, does it have implications for digital technologies, how they could help? Are these two related, and so on? So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on those. And also, if others have any thoughts on this, feel free to jump in as well. But let's give the authors a chance to share their thoughts.
Yeah, fully agree. I agree with your opinion, and we are very interested in these future directions. It's about the interrelationship among the three dimensions of the resilience, including prevention. We intend to involve the third dimensions. We don't look at this in this case. We may look at the prevention dimension and the interrelationship among these three dimensions in the future. Thank you very much for the suggestion. Fully agree.
So I think
Shiva, we can't hear you.
yeah, go ahead, Panos.
We cannot hear you, Shiva.
Seems like there's a little bit of an audio issue on Shiva end. Should we move on in the interest of time, because it's about 15 minutes already? Yeah. All right, so maybe let's move on to the next presenter. Shall we invite Ji-Yong Park to present on behalf of his team?
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, then let me get started. So first of all, thank you all for participating in this showcase, and I also appreciate all the editors for managing this timely special issue on digital resilience and organizing this wonderful showcase. I'm Ji-Yong Park from UNC Greensboro, and I'm so excited to present our work on behalf of my co-authors, Yoon Seok-son, and Corey Ernst from Notre Dame. And as you can see in the titles, our paper analyzed how US higher education coped with COVID-19 and how IT played a role in doing so. Actually, our research was motivated by our own experiences as a faculty member. I don't think it is necessary to repeat how we could continue our teaching in the middle of the pandemic, right? So back in 2020, we also observed these transitions in our institutions and the roles that information technologies played, such as Zoom, LMS, and various cloud-based solutions that support remote teaching and student learning management. And actually, the role of IT in higher education has become more important since the pandemic. So according to our survey, most CIOs of universities agree that the influences of IT have escalated after the pandemic, not only for operational, but also strategic decisions. At the same time, the role of the central authority of IT, such as CIOs, has been emphasized in shaping and influencing institutional directions after the pandemic. So this such anecdotal evidence implies the renewed importance of the way IT resources were governed and managed in organizations. So which is why we focused on IT governance. So in our study, we defined the digital resilience, especially in the service sectors, as investments, usage, and governance of IT in a way that affords organizations the capabilities to offer high quality services and maintain customer satisfaction during a crisis, similar to what they offer under normal conditions. Here, we focused on the degree of IT expenditures managed and spent by central IT versus local IT units. In this aspect, the centralized IT, which is our main focus, was defined as the percentage of centralized IT expenditure controlled by the CIOs or the central authority of IT. And although there could be many different ways to build the digital resilience, like other papers in this showcase present, what we found critical in many service sector organizations was the emergency mode operations that involves a process that enables an organization to continue to operate in crisis circumstances. So for higher educations, the emergency remote teaching, or ERT, was the case of emergency mode operations to continue to provide education services to their customers, that is the students. So we examined how centralized IT governance supported this ERT, emergency remote teaching. So organizational disaster responses can be classified into 4 phases: initial reactions, organizational integration, production, and transitions. In the context of higher education, universities were able to identify the emergency remote teaching as the most viable and realistic means to adapt to the pandemic. And to implement this ERT, necessary resources needed to be coordinated and integrated rapidly across the institutions. So in so doing, centralized IT governance can enable to streamline internal processes and also align the restructuring of IT resources with institutional goals and directions. And after implementing this ERT under this emergency operation mode, it was important to provide necessary technical support to sustain the production of services before moving on to the next, the new normal in the aftermath. And here, the centralized IT can help to coordinate existing resources and prioritize this technical support across the institutions. So to empirical access, we obtained data for 462 US 4-year universities and colleges from 2017 to 2020. And specifically, we scrapped all student reviews from ratemyprofessors.com and used average quality ratings and recommendation rates of courses offered by professors of each institutions to proxy the level of student satisfaction with classes over time, including during the pandemic. And then using the EDCO's annual surveys, we also measure the institution's annual IT expenditure and also the degree of IT expenditures controlled by the central IT unit. And for empirical analysis, we adapted the difference models to the context of COVID-19. So we designed our DID models in a way to compare how the impact of the pandemic shock differs across the two groups split by the treatment of interest, that is the degree of IT centralization. And here is the model-free evidence. You can see that the left figures confirm that the transition to online instruction began to be mentioned much more in the second quarter of 2020. At the same time, as highlighted on the right side, this coincides with the timing when university performance began to diverge depending on their IT spending. And when IT spending is separated into centralized and decentralized, we also found that the IT spending played a more critical role when it is governed in a centralized manner compared to a decentralized one. And as consistent with the model-free evidence, our econometric analysis confirms the significant role of IT centralizations during the pandemic. To provide deeper insight, we conducted a series of heterogeneity analysis. First, we found that there was centralized IT investment in management of IT, enterprise ISN infrastructure, communications infrastructure, and IT support services that played an important role during the pandemic, but not for educational technology, information security, and research computing. Second, we also found that the benefits of centralized IT are greater for universities that strategically positions the CIOs in the organizations to align the IT activities with organizational priorities and directions. Finally, this effect was also found to be different by organizational size and dissimilarity of local units. So this is our last slide. And as consistent with, so our finding implies that there is a need to reconsider the trade-off between centralization and decentralization of IT governance. So actually, the prior literature has suggested that responsiveness facilitated by decentralizations can be beneficial under high environmental uncertainties. However, our findings shows that the coordination benefits of IT centralizations can increase during the crisis circumstances. So organizations should consider the centralizing IT resource management, especially in response to crisis when time and resources are limited. For example, by establishing a task force with CIOs in key decision-making roles. So in this way, we expect that our paper can extend the realm of the business value of IT literature into digital resilience and emergency management. All right, so thank you for your attention, and let me turn it over to our discussant, Dr. Balaji Padmanabhan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeong, Yunsok, and Kuri. This is fabulous, and I think your team looked at something that we all have been facing, right? And I think you went through that in the review process because your domain was something that almost all of us are very familiar with here. So I thought I'd ask you maybe a couple of things about the paper itself, and then some beyond the paper, implications and future work. Now in the paper itself, I know you had looked at centralized IT spending specifically as the measure. Now you did a lot of robustness checks, right? That came through the review process. And sometimes, the robustness checks are there to check off and saying, yes, the main effect still applies. But a lot of times it gets more interesting when you find new things when you're doing the robustness checks that give you some additional insights, right? Now, can you talk a little bit about what came out in terms of additional nuances that look at the impact of decentralized spending on resilience when in the robustness checks? Like, are there anything that you want to highlight there?
You want to respond?
Or you can go.
This one. Sorry, Ewan. So I think that
the thing that was most intriguing to us was specifically looking at the underlying mechanisms and specifically which technologies were contributing to this. I think it was surprising maybe for us to learn that it was really the general technologies and not the specific, like a learning management system, for example, that that was contributing to the resilience. But things that most organizations would have, like enterprise information systems and cloud services, those types of things. I mean, the cloud seems to be a real key feature here that the universities that were deeply invested in the cloud, quite obviously, I think, were the ones that were able to adapt more quickly. But you brought up another point about the, looking at IT investment, and I would agree that it's not a perfect measure. I think it's better than a lot of the other things that we could use, because inevitably when you're looking at IT investment, you're probably going to have to get perceptions of what people believe. I should say IT governance. You're going to have to get perceptions of what people believe about where the authority lies. And it would be wonderful to have detailed information on that, but I think the only way you really get that is, being embedded in the organization and actually seeing how decisions are made, and who holds the authority, and then how implementation happens and all of those things. And short of that, I think what we had was probably about as good as you can get.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And just one more question about the paper itself. Again, encouraging you to, talk about some of the things that you did in the review process. The interviews with the CIOs also came through during the process, right? This is something that you all had to do, during the revision stages. And again, I know you talked to about 10 CIOs with, I think, who covered 14 or 15 different educational institutions about this effect, right? And what did you, were there some interesting insights that came out of those qualitative interviews that you did to complement the empirical work?
Well, I think we spent most of the time making sure that our results were consistent or credible with the CIO's opinions. There were a few interesting points that we learned. It relates to results or the paper. I think the details in the paper, but not really related to the results. We found out that the faculty and students that could not come inside the building during the COVID pandemic had to teach or be taught in their cars in the parking lot because they didn't have the appropriate communication infrastructure at home or even on campus. And that was very surprising for us. And second, information is very much stored and processed in a very siloed structure between departments. So like as an assistant professor who just joined academia, we don't know how like those informations are shared between departments and etc. But I was really surprised to learn that each department or each college don't have really a common understanding of how each different organizations or different departments manage their IT investments. So I think those needs to be those are worth investigating in future research.
And let me also add one more thing. Actually, so what we learned from the interviews was the importance of the CIOs in coping with the COVID-19. So every CIOs we interviewed emphasized their roles in institutional decision making. So that's why we additionally analyzed the moderating role of CIOs in facilitating the centralized IT. And also, as others also mentioned, so one of the key technologies CIOs all mentioned was the cloud-based services. But this is very consistent with our argument because most cloud-based services that are used across the institutions were managed by the central IT team. So we believe that cloud-based services would be an interesting topic for future research to further investigate the role of centralized IT governance. So the cloud will be the central component for the central IT governance.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one question about that, but just before that, there were quite a few things in the chat that talked about this. and we discussed it briefly, can you get the best of both worlds in the sense of, values of decentralized coordination versus centralized. And I think even in your paper and in your presentation, you mentioned that prior work actually showed that decentralization helps in highly, uncertain information environments. But I think in your paper, you note that highly uncertain, but within the expected band, right? So maybe within the 99% of possible outcomes, but centralization really helps in these extreme events, right? With these major shocks. And so that almost prompts the question in terms of implications. How can we get the best of both worlds, right? I mean, is there a trade-off here? Do you, or is there something you can do that actually gets both?
It's a really good question, and something that we talked to the CIOs about. The thing that they identified for us and really helped us frame this idea is the idea of extreme uncertainty. And they said, under normal circumstances, we see some benefit in decision-making at the department or school level. However, what this extreme level brought to us was that we all had to come together, and it really did break down the silos, and it allowed us to collectively make decisions that made sense for the institution. So going forward, I mean, what it really tells me is that there are benefits to centralized, but the challenges that we have with decentralized are simply that there are communication barriers between the levels of an organization. And if we can break down those levels of communication, the issues that are associated with those, then maybe we get the benefits of both sides of this. But I mean, the one thing the CIOs all said was that it's really difficult to get buy-in at multiple levels in a normal situation or even a relatively uncertain situation. So for them, COVID opened their eyes to a lot of things, and the organization's eyes to a lot of things, that if we just break down these communication barriers, we can fix stuff.
And yeah, thanks so much. I think I hate to break up this very interesting discussion, but obviously the timekeeper here, and we have to move on. Yeah, thank you so much, Balaji and Corey. And may I sort of invite our third set of presenters, Onkar, Terence, and Sunil.
Thank you, Waifong. So first of all, this is a joint work with Onkar and Terence, who are also on the call. And let me begin by thanking the guest special editors for this special issue, and also our wonderful AE Shunye, and the 3 reviewers who provided excellent feedback during the development of this paper. And can everybody hear me clearly? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, the purpose of this paper was basically to look at the OSS community resilience and do it in very granular ways. So we were interested in looking at how individual contributors in open source software communities, how they make resource allocation decisions in terms of contributions to their own projects versus contributions to others' projects. And in our mind, we thought that we were also looking at 2 different kinds of shocks, which were kind of intertwined at that time. So when we launched this project, we not only experienced the COVID phenomenon. I think around in 11th of March, I think it was declared as an epidemic. But we also saw, let's say, this cyclicality in terms of the unemployment shock that many IT professionals were experiencing both before and after the pandemic as well. So the idea here was also to tease out how 2 different kinds of shocks might have different implications in terms of the knowledge contributions that IT professionals make to their own projects versus to the projects to other IT professionals in these OSS communities. And in particular, we focus on the GitHub platform. So we collected data. I think even before we were thinking about submitting this paper to MIS Quarterly, we were already collecting this data, and we had collected fair amount of data for let's say starting from February 2019, going all the way to, let's say, May of 2020 or so. And we were already doing all these empirical analysis. And the key focus was to basically see how we might be able to shed some light on these two different dimensions of contributions to one's own versus others, because we thought there are many generalizable aspects of it. I mean, as academicians also, I think, we make these kinds of trade-offs. To what extent we are making investments in our own projects where you might be the lead author versus to what extent you are supporting the projects of others. And similar situation arises in R&D projects as well. With that, I will turn it over to Omkar to talk more about the OSS setting itself.
Thank you, Sunil. So the context of the study is the open source software domain. And as we all know and experience, the open source software as consumers is pretty much in line with our expectations. So on this slide, we have just sampled a few very popular open source projects that we use directly or indirectly. And the other graphics essentially talks about how developers see the open source software and its usefulness. So in terms of the open source software, the projects are not only used directly by developers, they're also used by developers indirectly, where they build on the open source projects for their softwares as well. The main research focus of our study essentially was to look at the resilience of IT knowledge workers who contribute to the open source software community. And we were interested in looking at and comparing these two shocks, namely the pandemic and unemployment. Now, the key differences here is that pandemic was sudden, it was global, and kind of it was for everybody. We all experienced that at the pandemic effect. But unemployment tends to be more cyclic in nature. And often it may be local to a particular country or region, and it is often personal in nature as well. So we thought of comparing these two shocks, given the differences in their origin and the effect that they have on the resilience of IT knowledge workers. We measured the resilience of workers based on their contributions to others versus own projects. That's the dependent variable for our project. In terms of building a hypothesis, our first hypothesis suggests that a pandemic will have a positive effect on contributions to others versus own, but unemployment, on the other hand, will have a negative effect. We have two theoretical perspectives to argue for these effects. The first one comes from the conservation of resources theory, where the idea is that individuals tend to focus on conserving their resources, and one could define resources as their time, effort, and many other things that we hold dear. As far as the pandemic, we saw that there was a loss of interaction. That is, we are working by ourselves due to some sort of a lockdown. So the idea was that people wanted to contribute to others' projects, which allows them to interact with others in the open source domain. As far as the economic insecurity is concerned, that leads people to contribute to their own projects because it has direct and indirect effects on their employment, is what we learned as well. The other effect that we see is from the pro-social behavior, which is more salient when it comes to pandemic, because people tend to help each other given these shocks. But on the other hand, when it comes to unemployment, although pro-social behavior is one of the motivating factors, it is less salient given the unemployment shock. Now, I'll turn over to Terence to talk about the empirical analysis.
Thank you, Omkar. Can you go to the next slide, Sunil? Thanks. So essentially what we did was to test our hypothesis, we collected data from developers or contributors to open source projects, and we collected data on roughly 18,000 or 19,000 workers, and we collected first on an hourly basis. So once we collected on an hourly basis, we aggregated it up to the daily level and the weekly level. So we test our hypothesis both at the daily and the weekly levels. We ended up with a sample of over 1.4 million member day observations. And so because we are interested in testing, the pandemic as well as unemployment, what we do is we test the unemployment hypothesis before the pandemic started, to avoid any interference with the pandemic. So we use pre-pandemic data for testing the unemployment shock, whereas we use the full data, that is both before and after the pandemic shock, to test the effects of the pandemic. So we use models such as Hausman-Taylor panel data models and other panel data models such as fixed effects and other models to test our hypothesis. And what we find support for both our hypotheses. That is, the pandemic actually increased the contributions to others, whereas the unemployment decreased the relative contributions to others compared to their own projects. So what we see here is a positive effect of the pandemic on contributions to others and negative effect of unemployment on contributions to others. And if we just go back a slide, Sunil, I can talk about the DID analysis. What we did was, Sunil, if you just go back one slide. Thanks. So essentially, there's also the argument that the pandemic resulted in both pandemic shock as well as the unemployment, right? So we wanted to tease out the effect of the unemployment compared to the pandemic. So what we did is we did a DID analysis wherein we looked at a control and a treatment group, where the control group was essentially those people were in states in the US where unemployment was essentially of the lowest quartile. What that means is these people were less likely to face the effects of unemployment because there were a lot of IT companies in these states. So the argument is that because these people were in states where a lot of IT companies are there, they're less likely to face the effects of the unemployment. Whereas people in states where there were fewer IT companies per capita, they're more likely to face the effects of unemployment. So we did that DID analysis by separating it out into this treatment and a control group. And what we find is we find support for our hypothesis there as well. And what this graph shows is we just find parallel trends assumption holds. We find that the trend was similar before the pandemic compared to post-pandemic. So both the panel regression models as well as the DID type analysis also supported both our hypotheses. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Sunil again to talk about the implications and the contributions.
So thank you, Terence. So I think the key contributions that we see in this paper are basically looking at the community resilience, but as it manifests in terms of the behavior at the individual level. And to some extent, I think it also solves some of the methodological problems, because we have seen some other articles published in IS journals where sometimes, there is a problem of ecological fallacy. Like we want to make claims about individual behavior. Unfortunately, we are using data at the country level or at some other geographic level. So we cannot really tease out the mechanism. So to that extent, I think paper also sorts out that issue very, very clearly. And we are looking at the opposite effects of different kinds of exogenous shocks, because the argument is that they invoke different kinds of motivations for the IT professionals, depending on the kind of shock that they are dealing with. And I think in terms of managerial implications, I will touch on the last point here, which is that it also provides some implications for managers in how to create right kinds of incentives to promote either the contributions to others' projects or to their own projects, depending on the kind of the shock that they are dealing with at a given moment in time. Empirically, I think we already know that people there is a difference of 10 times. People tend to contribute 10 times as much as to their own projects versus contributing to others' projects. So depending on where they are beginning to see some shortfall, they might take different kinds of initiatives. And we could not end this presentation without asking ChatGPT to write a poem for us to conclude what the central findings of the paper are. And I think we could not have done it any better than what ChatGPT did. So you can read it for yourself.
All right. Thank you very much, Sunil and team. I think the study was very interesting. I found the differential effect of the pandemic shock versus the unemployment particularly insightful. I also felt that there were some key implications that I would like to highlight, right? Because I think for me, one of the key takeaways is to show that as we talk about different types of shocks, it does seem to indicate that different types of shocks actually trigger different needs for different entities. And therefore, it's important to factor that into consideration. And I guess another key takeaway that I took away is that the team really looked at what they call micro-behavioral responses, right, at the developer level. But at the same time, it's quite clear that what happens at the individual level translates into how the community as a whole actually reacts. So I think this is also coming up as we talk about, as you know, I'm running sort of a joint commentary looking at digital resilience to the climate crisis. And we see that as well in terms of the need to look at digital resilience in multiple levels of analysis. And I think one more thing that the team highlighted, which I thought was a very good point, was that they talked about how there's a tendency for us to view shocks as events, but at the same time, shocks also sometimes happen as a process. And resilience and the way that we adapt also actually happens over time. So I think it's important to think about the element of time and to think about whether shocks actually only happen at a single point in time and over time. So I think that the paper really bore out these kind of messages very nicely. I just, in the interest of time, I really only have one main question, right? I wanted to ask the team about how they've thought about how their findings on ideas presented in this piece can actually generalize to sort of other studies or domains that is examining digital resilience in the context of other types of shocks. So I was wondering whether the team has any thoughts to this.
Thank you very much for your very kind comments, Wai-Fong. So I think when we think about the generalizability, we know that from Shardis et al. That it is very hard to establish generalizability in any one single study. So we are thinking in terms of the UTOS framework, which is how do these findings generalize to the units that we did not see. So for example, it might be a good idea to study other online communities, other open source communities, maybe like SourceForge or Stack Overflow, to see whether these findings generalize there. We can potentially think of the different kinds of treatments. So for example, some people might have personally experienced COVID in their own family versus a generalized COVID phenomenon. So how we think about the operationalizations of treatment per se. But there could also be different kinds of shocks like riots, people's reactions to wars, for example, or natural calamities. So that could be another way of thinking about the treatments. Then one can think of the operationalizations and outcomes. So how we define resilience, like in this case, we looked at the contributions, but there could be other ways one can potentially conceptualize the resilience of individual contributors. In the academic setting, it is how do you allocate your resources between research, teaching, and outreach and service kinds of activities, right? Things of that nature. And finally, going to the settings, I think this data is only looking at the IT professionals based in the US. It would be interesting to see how IT professionals in other countries reacted differently or similarly to the same kinds of shocks that we witnessed.
Yeah, thanks.
And kind of to build on that, like other types of shocks, such as financial crisis, where it's not so much of a health shock, but it's more of impacts in terms of financial. That could be another way, another type of shock to look at, because much of the arguments that we build are mostly based on social, pro-social arguments and all that. So maybe there are other theoretical mechanisms that other researchers could look at to address the other types of shocks.
Okay, great. So looking at how people spend their time and how shocks sort of impact that is sort of some ways to extend some of this work. Yeah. Thank you so much. So having listened to 3 DID papers, I'm sure we're all looking forward to the next paper, which is by Monica, Rajiv, and Carlos. Monica, over to you.
Hey, everyone can see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not on full screen though, Monica.
Interesting. How about now? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So we are going to take a slightly different approach in that we are going to highlight some of the backdrop of how we fell across this study. But first of all, I want to thank the co-editors. This was a very stressful, but very fun experience, really, because every round of the paper, we saw some really guided comments that helped us improve the work. So thank you to all 4 co-editors. And then also thank you to Andrew. We volunteered. Sometimes we were kind of sad that we volunteered, but we volunteered to have a transparency website. And so that was actually a second part of the work, setting up the transparency website. And I know Andrew spent quite a bit of time helping us set this up because I believe we were one of the first to do that. So our paper takes place in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's a state on the East Coast. Before the call for papers, we were actually on LinkedIn observing posts by the chief data officer of Virginia. He was the very first chief data officer for the Commonwealth. And we were just really interested about what he was posting, because what was happening is that the Commonwealth was dealing with a different shock. They were dealing with the opioid crisis. And Virginia was trying to figure out how to deal with this crisis. And then COVID hit. And the call hit at the same time. So we actually reached out to Carlos Rivera, who's now with Amazon, but at the time was the chief data officer. And what you're seeing here is actually a graph that didn't make it onto the paper. So in the paper, we show ICU usage. Here we're showing ventilator supply. And red is what the use is, right? And green is how much is available, right? And what's in red is what COVID is using, and what's in pink is the rest of the community using ventilators. And so Virginia was showing that actually they had ample ventilators, and this was true also of ICUs, and this was also true of hospital capacity. And so while other states were rushing to open up overflow facilities, Virginia did not, because they found that they didn't need to do this. So it actually saved them quite a bit of energy and time, which they then focused on setting up testing facilities. So they were early to setting up testing facilities, early to setting up an app for tracing of COVID. The next diagram I'm going to show you is a little bit later in the COVID epidemic. So that dashboard, the first dashboard that I showed you, showed up 10 days after a national emergency was announced, right? So in 10 days, Virginia was able to stand up these dashboards that were shared to all the hospital systems and all the emergency management folks that were dealing with the pandemic. This is a different dashboard. And in this case, we are looking at infection rates, and suddenly all of Virginia, right, is showing that they're doing okay. The infection rates are not going up, and we are in the July-August timeframe. But this particular graph is focusing on an area of Virginia where Rajiv and I live, which is Hampton Roads, and Hampton Roads has Virginia Beach, has Colonial Williamsburg, so it's a very touristy area of Virginia, but they're seeing infection rates go up. So while the rest of the country is in this meltdown over, some states, we're going to completely shut down and nobody's going anywhere. And some states are like, there's no COVID, that's made up, right? So we had various sort of reactions to this. Virginia actually was able to do targeted closings. So what the Virginia governor at the time did is he only shut down Hampton Roads, right? So it had a real effect, right, on the financials of the state, right? So what you're seeing here, and this is actually made it to the appendix of the paper, it's not in the actual paper, is that the rest of Virginia did not get this big financial impact. And we're looking at overall tax income, and then we broke it down by accommodations and food and drinks. And by the end of the first quarter of 2021, Virginia actually had a surplus, right? So it had a real financial impact on Virginia that they weren't really shutting everything down. They were doing it on a data-based decision-making, right? So our question became, how did Virginia do this, right? So how do governments use digital assets? And how do they create digital resilience? And what we used a process tracing approach. So we built a case study and we used multiple sources of data. And we had extensive data from interviews, which were added during the review process. But we also had, we met weekly with the chief data officer's team, and we had publicly available documents. We had archival data. We actually had so much data because a lot of this data was public. So we just had to go find it, and the chief data officer pointed us to it. And then some of the dashboards he shared. And so having him as a co-author actually was really, really helpful. So what we decide is that digital resilience is a dynamic capability. And it provided the theoretical basis for us, but what wasn't clear to us is how do you build this digital resilience? And we went really way back in time. We went to 2003, where Virginia is trying to accumulate this data assets along hundreds of agencies. And we found that there was the typical data silos, people not wanting to share for both good and bad reasons. good reasons being that there was laws that actually prohibited for some of this data to be shared. And so we find that there's 3 dynamic capabilities that allow them to do this. So on this chart across the top, you see our 3 dynamic capabilities, which were relationship building, intelligence creation, and value extraction. And they do come in that order. Intelligence creation cannot happen without relationship building. And relationship building is what took Virginia almost a decade to build this trust, to share data. And you notice across the bottom, the operational capabilities and the routines that helped create the relationship building dynamic capability, that many of them were not technology things. They were more relationship things. And I'm going to let my colleague Rajiv comment on this slide.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for the great setup. So as you saw in the first few slides that Monica shared, and these are actual slides that we got from Commonwealth of Virginia's dashboard. That's why they're hard to see, because they're actually from their screens. The role of information technology, the role of analytics in just being able to figure out where do we want to spend our resources. As Monica mentioned, other states were putting up hospital beds in parking lots, and Virginia said, no, we don't need to. We have a lot of spare capacity here. We can deal with it. But what I want to point out on this slide that you're looking at, the 3 dynamic capabilities, the first one has really nothing to do with information technology, at least not directly. It is the setup. And what we found in our extensive interviews and documentation reviews was this really is the first step. The remaining steps of being able to create intelligence and extract value will not happen, at least not effectively, if you don't have those relationships built. And those relationships take time. You cannot build those relationships as you are dealing with a shock. For example, COVID in March, you could not start building that relationship, which is why we went back all the way to early 2000s, where attempts were made to build those relationships. They made some progress, but they were still not at a point where they could get all the information, have all the parties sit down at the table and share information. So the first capability here, the relationship capability, you'll see it talks about data management. It talks about integration of systems. Even though there are technical issues, they're driven by relationships. For example, standardizing of data fields. Unless you can get people around the table and agree to how they're going to collect data or how they're going to report data, you will not be able to share consistent data. We know that issue when we teach in our classes. Same with integration. They hesitate. Do you have the authority to accept this data? Or what do you want? And the other party says, what do you need? And then the discussion goes on. And then the last point here on relationship building is governance structure. This was facilitated by legislation, by ordinances, by things that they could write down on paper that allowed people to share data. And then when you do all these things, then comes analytics and value extraction that eventually happens. What I also want to point out here are these arrows that are connecting horizontally. And that in the paper we call a mutually reinforcing nature of this dynamic capabilities. So not only does dynamic capability relate to other dynamic capability on the top, but there's also micro level relationships that are happening. So for example, good integration leads to better analytics because you have better dashboards, just like you saw here in the first slide. Oversight by the data commission, for example, leads to better cross-functional teams that allows them to build new products that then go into revenue generation. Even though we are dealing with the state, there was revenue generation. It's a not-for-profit entity, but they were able to generate revenue from these products. But more importantly, they were able to monetize that by cutting costs and allowing business to thrive. So the other papers that you saw are at individual level, group level, organization level. What I am arguing is that our work, which deals with the state, ensures that these other levels can be resilient, because without the state being resilient, it cannot provide the security, it cannot provide the services, it cannot collect taxes, it cannot make the spending for mitigation efforts. So the fact that you can have a state as a resilient entity allows other entities to become resilient. One other point I want to make that's in the paper, but we haven't put it on the slide here, is the learning that emerged from this. And that learning was because we were dealing with two shocks, opioid and then COVID, both of which, by the way, are still going on. We pointed out that there was this interlude, this period between shocks that is very crucial for learning. Typically what happens is there is a shock, everybody, adrenaline fires up, everybody gets the resources together. When the shock is subsided or under control or goes away, things kind of get back to normal. What we argued in the paper is that is the time really to set up these relationships, set up these infrastructure, and get ready for the next shock. So I'm going to pause here, and Monica, let you continue. I think you have maybe one more slide.
I think we're a little bit over time. Yeah.
Yeah, we're out of time. We were just going to plug our transparency website. Make sure and go to it because we actually have a section that has explanations of things that happened after.
Okay, good.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I know we're running out of time. Thank you for that. I really enjoyed reading this paper, and obviously very interesting because of you examining two major shocks and also the interlude in between. So the learning effects, very interesting, and how a state organization learns from one to develop resilience capabilities for the next, and there's a continuous cycle, right? The question that I have is more, I guess, policy level or practitioner oriented. While the US government was quite polarized, right, during the pandemic, it looks, or at least your study shows, that the people on the ground were really trying to make things happen and utilizing data to make informed choices that would impact people. So maybe you could comment on that.
That's probably my favorite question because it was really just quite wonderful to interview all these people on the ground level, because politics didn't matter at that level. People were just truly worried about what was going on and how to keep people healthy, how to keep people employed. One of the papers talks about them setting up a workforce portal for people to find work because they couldn't go to the unemployment office. So at the ground level, individuals didn't care about polarization. They cared about keeping Virginians healthy and financially secure, which was wonderful. I don't know if you want to add to that, Rajiv.
No, I agree with you. That's one of the insights or learning from this process. We developed a new sense of respect for government workers and even government leaders that we spoke with. You could not tell which party they came from. Panos, as you mentioned, the government was polarized. The US is still very polarized. In fact, the state was pressured by the White House at that time to shut down the entire state. And our governor said no. And that's why the results you saw that Monica showed. So because they were looking out for the best interests of the people.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Waifang.
Okay, great. So our last presentation, and then we should be in time for the closing. Yeah. Okay. All right. So on behalf of the team, let me get started in terms of sharing some of our ideas in our editorial, and then I'll pass it over to Balaji to talk about the future implications. So when we are looking at digital resilience, we were really trying to understand how we are reacting and adapting and transforming ourselves to major shocks. And we talk about major shocks, it's really discussing existential threats that actually pose long-term and continuous risks to various entities. And as we saw in the presentations just now, these can be individuals, it can be groups, it can be organizations, right? And as we can see, especially with the COVID-19 was not our first shock that we faced, and it will not be our last. As we look forward, we can already see several future threats looming. And in particular, I think climate change will be one of the major shocks that we will have to deal with. So that naturally raises the question of how different entities can actually build the resilience and to these various shocks. This is where we tap on the literature that defines what resilience is about. And they define resilience to be about absorbing a shock, adapting to the disruption, as well as transforming ourselves into a stable state where we are actually better prepared to deal with these future major shocks. And clearly, for us in the IS domain, digital technologies, in our view, will play a major role in helping. And therefore, for us, we define digital resilience as the capabilities that are developed with the use of digital technologies to help with this absorb, adapt, and transformation processes. So one of the key things that we want to explain about why are we coming up with this digital resilience, it's because when we look at implementation of technologies, a lot of times they are not solely implemented for the purpose of resilience. It's usually motivated by other objectives, such as operational efficiencies and competitive advantage. So focusing and introducing this concept of digital resilience can help us to understand what kind of capabilities is required to achieve this idea of being resilient to various major shocks. And we can see that sometimes the various objectives can be contradictory because, for example, before COVID-19, a lot of supply chains were looking at just-in-time strategies that optimize on cost and time. But as a result, that actually makes them less resilient and less able to react to shocks. So as we can see, because it's sometimes contradicting, it's important for us to think about what digital resilience means. And of course, with this growing uncertainty and many future shocks we expect to see, we think this is an important concept that we really need to understand and unpack. So in our editorial, we actually came up with a framework that discusses how digital technology characteristics actually create the capabilities or enhance the capabilities for organization to absorb, to adapt, as well as to transform themselves. So in the interest of time, maybe just let me highlight a few of these digital characteristics. So I think when Monica presented on her paper, very clearly we saw that the COVA case actually leveraged on the intelligence sensing capabilities of digital technologies that allowed them to really gather and analyze data that helps them to better understand the situations. And that's really important when you're a very uncertain situation where things are constantly changing. But at the same time, we also clearly see that for them to be successful, they need the governance structures. And as Rajiv was saying, you can't be building relationships during the crisis. You actually have to have some of these done before and after, and as you prepare for the next crisis. So similarly, as we look at adaptation, this is really talking about how entities can quickly adapt. And here we clearly saw that the ubiquity and the accessibility of digital technologies played a major role where all the activities are moving online. And yet at the same time, we also saw, like in the case of the university as presented by Corey and his team, that in order for universities to do well here, they actually need to have the routines. Whether the technologies are centralized or decentralized does make a difference. So the organization restructuring actually does matter. And finally, when we talk about transformation, transformation is about making fundamental changes that might actually change organizational structures in the future. As organizations leverage on the modularity and recombinability of digital technologies, they also have to figure out which of these changes that they have quickly adapted to will be staying and more transforming their businesses in the long term. That requires them to really think about and learn from what are some of these reconfigured technologies that is really going to make an impact on the various entities. Right. So in the interest of time, I'll leave you to read the rest in the editorial, and I'll pass it over to Balaji to talk about the implications for research.
Thank you, Weifang. So very quickly, there are 4 themes that we touched upon in the editorial. And can you go to the next slide, Weifang? Yeah, so I think the first is very key, and this is a very different way in which we should look at entire systems, right? So as IS researchers, our unit of analysis many times has been individuals and firms, and we've looked at industries as well, but from a different lens, right? So here we feel that from the resilience point of view, there are lots of opportunities to look at the design of entire public-private ecosystems and the role that information can play here, right? From a resilience perspective itself, right? So simple things like data sharing mechanisms and so on, right? So how do we enable this in a way in which you can get resilience? And when we design these public-private ecosystems, it's important to also understand that we have to design them for potentially conflicting objectives, right? Because private goods and public goods, and on potentially conflicting objectives, I think, going back to Shiva's story, Monk 2 wanted to smoke, but the great master wanted world peace. So what actually happened on day 3 is they came out and Monk 2 had stopped smoking. And so Monk 1 asked Monk 2, why did you stop smoking? And Monk 2 said that, look, the great master actually felt that it was not okay for monks to smoke, but if monks who smoke meditate, then meditation will make them not want to smoke. And that's what happened, right? So sometimes you have these conflicting objectives, and then you have entire ecosystems that operate smoothly. So going to the next slide, I'll let you work on this later, Arun. I know you're thinking to take that analogy further. But related to this, we have to think of important governance mechanisms on how data should be shared, because if you don't, what we have seen in our own world is that you can very quickly get power concentration in select entities because of major shocks. And when this happens, again, entire ecosystems may not function as we would want them to. And there are lots of opportunities to think of also regulation in this, both carrots as well as sticks, right? Incentive mechanisms as well as regulation to make sure that the system operates in order to facilitate resilience. Next slide, please, here. And I think we had 2 important places to end, and there's a lot of work in our community where people have started already looking at digital inequities, and I think there are 2 pieces of this. First is we want to actually study and show when this might arise. In the COVID pandemic, for instance, we saw that this was a huge problem, and it was not just access to technology. Sometimes even if you provide access to technology, you may not have the ability to use it properly, right? There might be other resources you need in order to use that effectively. And so this creates, I think people realize this much after the fact. And I think we need to plan for this more proactively. And I think here research could show these things and then also talk about how can we design systems that can mitigate digital inequities. And finally, the last thing that we point to in our paper is also the temporality here. And thinking about how can we prepare, right? So, I think Shiva alluded to the fact that centralization, decentralization, how do these pan out in different stages? And so in our own absorb, adapt, and transform framework, thinking more deeply about how they overlap and what that means for the design of systems would be very interesting to do. And also how can we have what's the prepare stage that needs to happen in order for these capabilities to fully be developed. Right. So these are, I think our editorial gets into these in more detail. And this is a fascinating area, I think, across the board. And it's just a different way for us to look at our world. Right. So earlier we were looking at it from the point of view of individual firms, profit maximization, social welfare, and so on. But to look at these problems from the point of view of resilience to major shocks, I think, opens up an entire new perspective into this world. So I'll just stop here and invite Arun to comment on everything he's heard so far and take us to our closing. So thank you, Arun.
Thanks so much, Balaji, and thanks for this wonderful showcase event, to the entire team, and of course to Andrew for all of his leadership through this process. I just want to make a few comments about the editorial, really. I mean, that's my initial set of comments here. I think it's a terrific editorial. One I expect is going to be very influential for three reasons, which I thought stood out to me. The first was just the framing and the conceptualization on how we think about resilience. The three different phases: the absorb, the adapt, the transform, and presenting a very clear vocabulary and set of concepts to organize our thinking around resilience. I think that's a terrific articulation, very clearly separated conceptually. The second part to me was the notion that the multiple levels of analysis and the way they are, how these concepts become relevant at each level, but also potentially in the intertwining between these levels is extremely important. And the third part, of course, is the isolation of the potential capabilities and pathways that we can think about to understand how the capabilities could be developed, and how do we reach these states of development. So that's sort of what I thought. It fuels a lot of the special issue, along with the editorial, fuel a lot of opportunities for future research. I have a few very quick observations, which I think came up in different ways in our conversation today. The first one is just in terms of shocks and risks. Andrew started off with this comment on our world at risk, the UNO report, and just the way we think about risks, how that alters given events like these unprecedented shocks, where you're dealing with unknown unknowns as opposed to known unknowns. And a lot of the world management framework around risk tends to be around the known unknowns. And so there are distributions that you're estimating, but here you're hitting the unknown unknowns. So that's my first comment there in terms of how that shifts. And then obviously we talked about the shock as a process, which brings up an interesting question about how that process intertwines with the evolution of the risk itself. So it's not the risks are once and done. As the shock progresses from a process standpoint, how do the known unknowns, how do the unknown unknowns manifest in different ways with greater information becoming available? That becomes a very interesting part of the sensing and learning about the risks itself, because how we contend with it. So this is sort of the shocks and risks and how do we think about it more from an evolution progressing standpoint. The second point I had here was around attention. So when we think about this, the general vocabulary today is the new normal. You know, we're done with the pandemic. Now we're focused on the new normal. And I don't know how many people are now thinking about the next pandemic. I think the general sense, oftentimes you bump into people, is the pandemic's over, it's done. So let's focus on the new normal and whatever that is, you know. So how much of this thinking, how do we keep attention focused on an issue where people relegated over to emergency management or disaster recovery, as opposed to building resilience capability? So organizations do have disaster recovery services, emergency management services, but how is that attention focused, given that we have learned that mother is the necessity is the mother of invention, and absent that crisis mindset, how is attention focused on resilience? Otherwise, managerial attention, resources, etc., do not get allocated in this direction. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's just one of those thorny questions which just sort of keeps coming back to my mind. The third point is around emergence. And I think this came up, Sunil brought this point in terms of micro levels, understanding it and progressing. I think this is really an important point, that we have levels. I think along with levels, we need to intertwine the notion of time to understand how grassroots And top-down initiatives come together in extremely uncertain context because it's not business as normal. But how do you shift what's happening at the grassroots versus what's happening top-down? That brings up a very interesting dynamic in terms of the emergence of possible ways to absorb, adapt, and transform along the lines that was expressed in your editorial. My final point, I think, is likely extremely troubling for us as a society, and that is around disparities. And that's the distinction between haves and have-nots. So today, if we look at what's happened with generative AI, and I'm going to go straight there for this audience, right? Think about the very few companies that have invested billions of dollars towards creating these capabilities. They have data, they have scientists, they have the capacity to do these things. But how do we actually, in an era where intelligence is going to be extremely important to deal with risks and new types of risks, how is the issue around the have and have-nots addressed further as we seem to find increasing concentration of these resources? And I think, Balaji, you got to some of this with your private-public partnerships in what you were referring to. But I don't have a clean fix on this because the concentration seems to be going in the other direction in some ways. I'm sure there are other types of public goods issues that can come in, like interfaces and APIs and whatnot, that allow others to advantage or benefit from these resources. So those are some comments that come to my mind. But overall, I thought it was just a outstanding special issue which benefits the field and other fields greatly, and the editorial is truly inspirational. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And I guess we are already over time, but I would encourage anyone that wants to make any last-minute comments from the audience, perhaps anyone that wants to express any last-minute questions, or even the panelists themselves, if they want to reflect on some of the things that Aaron has mentioned.
I think just want to, if I can chip in, Arun made a great point, like how much of investment or attention should be focused on resilience versus running day-to-day operations, because people don't want to be in that mode, because that can be very stressful for us as humans as well, or for any organization. So I think it will be interesting to see, like, how to, walk a fine line between allocating sufficient resources for emergency or maybe disasters, but then not devote so much of attention to it that we compromise on these other important issues related to addressing inequalities or concentration of resources and things of that nature, because at the end of the day, attention and resources are kind of finite. So I don't know how the co-editors feel about that issue, and if they would like to weigh in.
Yeah, I think there are definitely sort of conflicting objectives, which I guess organizations will always have to balance. Yeah. I think I would like to highlight that I think we are really only starting to introduce and scratch the surface of this concept of digital resilience. What we hope to see is actually a greater emphasis and development in this regard. So I just wrote in the chat that as we're developing the commentary for digital resilience on climate crisis, we are also beginning to see that if we think about different types of shocks, we start to realize that we got to think about digital resilience a little bit differently. And some of the other elements will come in. I think that will evolve as we start to think about how does this concept apply to sort of yet a different context or crisis. So I would encourage all of us to continue to develop sort of this concept and look at this further as we go along. Yeah.
And also, if I can have also the word, I agree that the relationship between major shocks and digital resilience needs to be expanded. we define major shocks as an existential threat to organizations, to society, to ecosystems, to individuals. And obviously we were thinking of COVID and the new special issue commentary on climate crisis extends that. But with generative AI, it's almost like the major shock is coming from within, underneath our feet. This notion of who has control of the resources, who controls the digital capabilities that allow organizations to be resilient to such shocks, and the disparities that and inequalities that are created in the process is a very important question. And as a community, I think we need to tackle it.
Okay, and then maybe with that, shall we close the webinar? Because I think it's late for some of us, especially for Andrew. I think it's like 1+ for you already. I should let Andrew get back to bed and the rest of us get back to work. So we would like to thank everyone for your for staying up, for listening to us, and thanks to all the panelists for your great sharing and great insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.